like to thank Margarita and Antonita for organizing this, and everyone else for, it's been a great conference so far. All translations are my own unless I note otherwise. So Herodas's Mimiamb 2 is essentially a monologue. Boskos, or pimp, Bateros, significant name, Mr. Stammer. He is delivering a prosecution speech in a law court on Kos against a ship's captain, Thales, so Mr. Bloom, for the abduction and assault of one of his prostitutes, Myrtale, Miss Pusey, or Fanny. More on that later. In a farcical imitation of Attic-Archery, Bateros presents Myrtale nude to the jury as a proof of Thales's violence, a move obviously meant to recall Hyperides's exposure of Phryne to the decasts during her trial for Asibea. But I want to suggest that there's something more sophisticated going on beneath a crude comical surface, and for Herodas's audience, probably quite a standard parody of Attic-Archery. Now, part of the vulgar absurdity of Bateros' display of Myrtale is his claim that Thales has depilated Myrtale's genital region. Number one on the handout, hos lea tau titilen, onages hutos. Hutos is Thales. And as we all know, and A. Houseman was the first to point out very early on in scholarship on Herodas, as a porn name, Myrtale would already have been depilated. He calls it the best joke in the mime, but it's not just humor, it's not just erotic or pornographic. I think our suspicions should be aroused instead by the use of two, what I'm going to call programmatic verbs. And I call them programmatic because they also appear in Mimiamb 8. They are Tilo and Helco, and it's generally accepted that Mimiamb 8 is a programmatic poem. So number 2 on the handout, where the speaker, Herodas, or identified as Herodas, describes a dream in which he's leading this goat and it gets snatched by goat herds. They butcher it, they tear it up and eat it. And he interprets this in some way as the reception of his poetry in the future. The pun, let's say, on melos, so limb, and song, so the spragmos of the goat, and then the reception of his poetry, whether it's how it's being torn apart, I'm not sure. So if we just compare here, we have in Mimiamb 8 and Mimiamb 2, we have ex-Elco and Helco. We have BAs, I guess, corresponding somewhat with the Adsdo. And then we have Tilo, Etilen, and Tilius and Tilepsin. So I think there's probably something metapoetic afoot here. There are other reasons to think that. And I think in my mate, it's generally accepted that Herodas is the poet, and the goat, I think, is a pretty obvious symbol for dramatic poetry, which includes the mime. So Bateros is a poet, and Myrtale perhaps is his poetry. Now, Edith Fall has compared Myrtale silent, displayed nude to the audience to various personifications of abstract concepts in old comedy. But before I look at that, I want to go back to, I think, an earlier version of this sort of thinking. And I use the theory of Laycock and Johnson about conceptual metaphor. You don't necessarily need to subscribe to that. But the idea is, I'll say, poetry is a woman, poems are women. Those are the conceptual metaphors. And then there are lots of metaphorical expressions that derive from that. So if we had a commercialized poem, that poem could be imagined as a prostitute, and the poet could be imagined or thought of as a pimp. I'm referring to Pindar's Second Isthmian Ode. So we have, he avoids perhaps the stronger language, but Ergatius, for example, could refer to a prostitute, to a day laborer. And I think Pindar's being a little bit naughty and sort of alluding to porne with epernanto, so it's an etymological play there, pern to porn. And then say arguro tisai prosopa, so being silvered over, so it's money, but also we saw discussion of white lead being applied as makeup to prostitutes yesterday. So there's also that sort of thing going on. And I don't have time to talk about Callimachus's reference of this, so I'm going to have to drop that there. So when Aristophanes talks about Lady Comedy or has Aeschylus bring on the muse of Euripides, he's tapping into an earlier tradition or discourse, I think. And I think it's one that old comedy really makes its own. Really, they really like this sort of metaphor. So in Knights, we have in the Parabasis, Aristophanes talking about producing plays, and comedy is imagined, or the production of comedy is imagined as courting a woman. So we have this play on peirao and on charistomai, so to attempt, but also to make a sexual advance, to receive the grace of the muse, but also to receive her sexual favors. So there's similar things going on, let's say in Cratinus's Pitine, the wine flask, where comedy is his lawful wife, but she, to cut it short, is seeking a divorce because of his drinking. A bit more complicated than that. But for a situation that's comparable to what's going on with Myrtale, when we're thinking like this, I'm thinking something like Pherecrates' Chiron, where we have this account where music is brought on stage, and we have this account of all of the sort of different new musicians. And they're described as abusive lovers of music, and their innovations in music are transformed into these violent sexual acts. They're degrading and contorting the true body, right? Body of music. Pertinent maybe is Timotheus of Miletus, who, sorry, going off video, there we are, who, not coincidentally, Thales shares his name with Thales of Miletus, and his sort of barbarian ancestry is part of Badarus's speech. So this is another aspect of it, how specific changes in art or in music or poetry can be imagined as sexual violence. I think a similar example, and one which puts us maybe on the right track, comes from Frogs. Early on in Frogs, Dionysus is complaining about the new crop of tragedians after Euripides. And so you can sort of see the two different ways I think that this metaphor works here. So they're pissing on tragedy, prosureo, which is quite easy for us to understand how that works. They're pissing on tragedy, but it's also about fertility, right, or your potency. So Dionysus says he's looking for a poet who's gonimos, who's potent or ballsy, right? So a good poet begets legitimate children with the muse, the plays, and a bad poet is impotent, has poetic erectile dysfunction, and does something perverse with the muse and begets bastard plays, nathoi. And that ties in with another conceptual metaphor I like to think of. Ideas are progeneration. So if we think about how the Greeks think about reproduction. But as the true muse can be corrupted and degraded by upstart poets, by these neophyte tragedians in Dionysus's eyes, there are also corrupt and degenerate muses which can exist as a personification of a female body that stands for the poet's corpus, body corpus. And we get that in prose. You get it in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the Attic and the Asian Muse. You get it in Plutarch's comparison of Aristophanes and Menander. Aristophanes' poetry is like a harlot, and Menander's poetry is your chaste citizen wife. It's so lovely. Even earlier, Prodicus's choice of Heracles, virtue and vice. It's just a continuous way of thinking. And where I'm going to the muse of Euripides and Frogs. And also there we have maybe the beginning of Callimachus's overweight muse in the Aetio prologue. Euripides doesn't give us a muse of Aeschylus, but we do have bloated Aeschylean tragedy. This is the passage where she's introduced. Aeschylus is the speaker. Sorry, I didn't put that in. And then Dionysus. So there's some sort of interesting connections between this scene, this passage, and Mimiamb too. So the first kind of head, Limona and Drepo, and I think Drepo is synonymous basically with tiller, plucking, culling, gathering something. And limon is also a double entendre for the pubic area. So if you remember, Myrtale's pubic region has been depilated. I think it's in Euripides' Cyclops, you definitely have that limon for the pubic region. But the striking thing for me, the connection between them is the Muse of Euripides is definitely being portrayed as a prostitute. I think as a young one, that's a separate debate. There's a striking similarity between the way that they're introduced, this sort of mock Muse invocation with De Euro, and then they're in the same sedes. I don't know if that's that important, but they're also hourly quite close. De Euro Muse Euripidu, De Euro Myrtale Kaisu. And there are other correspondences between Mimiamb 2 and frogs, especially the agon. There's a lot of stuff about scales. There's the idea of basinismos being put to a test, which makes you think of Dionysus and Xanthias getting whipped. But I don't have too much time to go into that. But where we're heading is Myrtale obviously is not the Muse of Euripides, doesn't stand for Euripidean poetics, at least not entirely. So what does Myrtale stand for? What does she symbolize as a woman? What kind of poetry? And I suggest that the answer lies in her name and in her one act in the poem. So Myrtale is a typically obscene attire name derived from myrton or myrtos or myrte, one of these terms. I think it's myrton, it's a myrtle berry. We know that myrtle is sacred to Aphrodite. I know that some people in the audience will know you still get myrtle boughs and garlands at weddings. But here we're talking about the berry, I think. And my suspicion is that the rather rude appearance of the fruit, the way that the calyx opens at the end, led to the term being used as a slang term for vulva. That's as early as Archilochus, and it's very common in the old comedians. In later medical literature, it's used for the clitoris, and that's also clear why that happens because of the shape. But here we're talking about the pubic region, and the classic example, it has to be, otherwise the puns don't work, is Plato's Phaon, so Plato Comicus, where we have these sort of mock gods and these offerings being brought, and they're double entendres. And the one that we're looking at is Myrton Pinakiskos Kedi Paratatilmenon, so hand-picked berries. You pick berries by hand, but also you pluck pubic hair by hand. We know that Athenian women had slaves dedicated just for plucking their hair because the gods don't like the smell of the lamp, so people would also singe their pubic hair off. That I'm trying to make is that there's a special connection, I think, between the iambos and the display of female genitalia. Here's a fragment ripped out of context because I just want to focus on the term anacertopolen or anacertolen from anacertesthai to expose, self-exposure, a term for, these are terms of reproach for pornine. There are other, so Archilochus, I think, at the start of the entry. And I'm talking about the Anasyrna of Baubo in the Orphic Mysteries to cheer up Demeter. So we know the version in the Homeric hymn to Demeter where serving girl Iambe is making jokes to cheer up Demeter. But there are also Orphic versions which are difficult to work with because they're preserved by the church fathers who maybe have their own motives. So we have Clement of Alexandria quoting these Orphic verses. So we have Anacertato, so lifting up her robes. Dexa de Panta is similar to what Baterus says to Myrtale. Dexa siate in pati, show yourself to all, sort of thing. And then it gets even stranger. Things start to, you get Arnobius talking about Baubo making her genital area look smooth and soft, not having any hair, making it look like a youth. He might be getting muddled with Iacchus hiding underneath Baubo's skirts, and there are always faces on these statues. But there's still, I think there's a connection, there's something going on. And Vanessa Cazzato has argued quite recently that Mimiamb 1 is modeled on the Demeter scenes that we know, and is supposed to complement a poetic initiation scene in fragment of Aponax in Coiraboscus's commentary on Hephaestion, when Hipponas goes down to the sea and there's an old woman washing wool in the basin, and she says, you're going to upset the basin, and spontaneously, either in iambic trimeter or in coleams. So to fly through all of that, just to say, if we have in Mimiamb 1, we have this sort of imitation of Demeter at Eleusis, and we also know that Herodas knows about the Orphic Mysteries. What's missing is this exposure of genitals. We don't know if Herodas arranged his poetry in the papyrus that we have, but if it wasn't him, that they certainly knew what they were doing. So what I'm trying to say is I want to identify Myrtale as iambe, or because there are baubones in 6 and 7, which are dildos, which are also metapoetic symbols. So then we have iambe and we have baubos, sort of two sides of the same coin. We have male and female genitalia as these sort of as sexual simulacra. So a female prostitute and a dildo are in some ways sexual simulacra as symbols for poetry. So to try and bring it all together, just sort of see what's going on here. We've got Myrtale as an iambe figure standing in for the iambos. We have the goat standing for dramatic poetry, for mime. So we have the fusion of genres, perhaps, something like that. But if Myrtale is supposed to stand for the iambos, then what's Thales doing? What's happened to the iambic poetry that is supposedly belongs to Badarus, to the pimp? So we had Helco, we had Biasgomai, we saw in Pherocrates, we saw in Aristophanes poetic change being imagined as a form of sexual violence, degradation, and that certainly fits with verbs like Helco and Biasgomai. There's also the notion of plagiarism with a verb like Helco. You have parelco in Clouds when Aristophanes accuses Eupolis of stealing knights. You have Socrates saying that Pericles derived stuff from Anaxagoras and he uses Helco, so draw upon a source. But what I'm really interested in is Tilo, because it's in Mimiamb 2, it's in Mimiamb 8, and I'm interested in Laos as a smoothness. So that's what's happened to this symbol. That's what Tilo could mean, to pluck, to criticize, something like this. But I think we're supposed to interpret Tilo in the laotes, in the smoothness. That's how the verb is realized on the body of iambic poetry. Now, unfortunately, to my knowledge, I've never seen the term laos used of poetry in Greek. It is used by Catullus, however, Catullus 1, which needs no introduction, where the sort of the physical object, the book scroll, acts as a metonym for the polish of Catullus's verses. We know that pumice stones are used to smooth the papyrus, to take the fibers off, but we also know, it's the other fascinating thing, they were used as razors or ancient epilators to smooth the skin, but also to remove hair. It's in Ovid, it's in Martial, it's in Juvenal, it's in Horace's verse epistles. It's the final verse epistle in book 1. He talks about this smoothened book scroll, but also imagines his poetry as a prostitute. So there, the metonym and the metaphor kind of converge. But I think that's probably the latter half of the story. I don't think that when Badarus accuses Thales of depilating Myrtale as a symbol of iambic poetry, that he's necessarily talking about refinement. I suggest that for our reading, the depilation represents a sterilization, castration, a removal of what makes poetry iambic poetry. It's supposed to be rough, it's supposed to be harsh. It's a rough and hairy genre. So probably the most common term you get for iambic poetry is pikros. So Hipponax is always called pikros. You get that in earlier on in funerary epigram like Theocritus and the Aeneas of Tarentum, and you get it much later in Tzetzes, let's say. But the best example for what I think is going on here metapoetically and in terms of gender, in terms of what's being done to Myrtale's body is our friend Babrius, in the proem to the Mimiamb Exotica, where we have here, Picron Iambon, Sclera Cola Telunas, talks about softening or literally feminizing the hard limbs of harsh iambs. And that's sort of how I want to interpret Tilo and Leos in terms of Myrtale's body, that this is the sterilization or the sanitization of iambic poetry. So to wrap up very quickly, I've just gone over time. I think I want to emphasize how the female body, how gendered thinking, how people think about sexual violence, people think about what women's bodies look like, is intrinsic to metapoetic discourse, to describing aspects of poetic production and reception. I talked about ideas of progeneration. Women are formless matter, raw material, hule, for the male poet to shape. You get poetry embodied as a woman and has the physical features which correspond with the quality of the poetry, and then things that happen to poetry can be imagined in all sorts of different ways. We had here mainly genital depilation for the destruction of iambos. The other thing I want to stress, I don't think that any of this is arbitrary or spontaneous. They're not flights of poetic fancy. Myrtale is shaped by this poetic tradition that Herodas is in, which is also the product of the real social circumstances of his time and his audience's time. You can't understand how this works unless you know about prostitution, about pimps, about genital depilation. And she doesn't have the infamy of Pandora or a Helen or a Phryne, and she is like them. It is the same sort of thing. But she's still, shaping her part of this discourse, and there's going to be another female symbol after her. And to end on a note of optimism, because the stuff is quite dark actually, and we're very desensitized to it. Poets are products of circumstances, upbringing, their poetic tradition, but they also get to change the poetic tradition. So, thank you.